All right. Hello again. My name is Aaron Bracy, and I'm happy to be joined today by Bob Wankel. Bob is the Phillies writer and senior betting writer for Crossing Broad. And Bob, thanks very much for joining Bracy Sports Media today.
I appreciate you having me on. This is cool. Get an opportunity to talk about little sports. They may not be happening for a while, but it's still good to talk anyway, you know?
It's definitely nice, nice diversion. And one of the reasons why I tried to start this because, I miss talking sports, going to games, covering the games, as I'm sure you do. So I guess we'll start there. As far as the Phillies are concerned, what do you miss most about going to the games and covering the games?
Yeah, it was a great opportunity last year. We became credentialed and started going down there. And, you really just started to get into the rhythm of it, really understand the way that things work from a procedural standpoint. And this year we were kind of looking to build off of that coverage, and it's unfortunate for us personally as a company. We're not able to do that right now, but it was a big part of what we were going to do was focus our coverage and try to take a little bit of a different spin on things. But that's just not in the cards right now. So we're all kind of sitting here from afar, and, it's just a matter of seeing what will a season look like once we do resume, if that happens to be this year.
I thought you were going to say the ice cream from Frank.
Yeah, and also the ice cream from Frank. Yeah, I think I put on about 12 pounds last summer just from the ice cream alone. So that was like the thing you look forward to the most down there.
Yeah, definitely missed that Turkey Hill ice cream from Citzens Bank Park. But you mentioned the realignment. There are a couple possibilities on the table that are being reported, one of which is playing all the games in Arizona and quarantining the teams there. The other scenario is playing at two spring training sites in Arizona and Florida. Of those two scenarios, which one do you like the most? Which one do you think is the biggest possibility of actually happening?
So if you have an Arizona and Florida setup, you have 26 different stadiums that you can work around. And the familiarity with the actual on-site locations you'd be playing at your spring training complexes, that makes sense. But when you look at it in both scenarios, I'm not optimistic that this is going to come together. I think there are so many different obstacles that are going to have to be tackled and ironed out for this to work. The issue with Florida is that the complexes are spread out across the state. And so if you're going to have to put a staff into quarantine, coaching staff into quarantine, the team itself, it's not like everything is within a 45-minute radius. And so at least with the Arizona standpoint, pretty much all of those complexes are within an hour of one another. And so from a logistics standpoint, in terms of quarantine and getting them on site to play, Arizona makes more sense to me, but I think that there are other considerations that come into play that are going to make that very, very difficult.
So if we just did go by the scenarios, and I know you said Arizona makes more sense, but with the Grapefruit League scenario with the teams playing in Florida where they realign the divisions, which has the Phillies playing with the Yankees, Blue Jays, Tigers, and Pirates, if that were to happen, and I know you're saying that you think that's the lesser of the two scenarios, how do you think that would impact the Phillies? And do you think that scenario benefits them at all or hurts them?
Well, obviously the Yankees would present a considerable roadblock, but I think the ability to take out that second tier to middle tier and replace them with teams like the Pirates and Blue Jays would be advantageous for the Phillies to get rid of the Braves, to get rid of the Nationals, and even the Mets. I know they had a couple big injury blows there at the end as we were leading up to this, this dead period. But I think from a pure baseball standpoint, that realignment would be great for the Phillies and would give them a chance. And I think the one thing that would be truly interesting to see about how this all plays out is I think that I like baseball's willingness to be creative. Like, I commend Major League Baseball for putting these plans out there. And maybe they do reach a point where they believe, hey, this is safe enough that we can take a reasonable risk here. But from just a baseball standpoint, yeah, I believe that would be a great thing for the Phillies, because if we were to play a traditional 162, I don't know how great that would look on the field for this team right now.
We'll get to that in a second, but let's stay with the realignment possibilities. And one of the challenges, and you mentioned there are many challenges, is that players would have to be quarantined. And one of the things that came out Friday is Zach Wheeler, who's expecting a baby and his first child in July, said that there's no way he's missing the birth of his child. And paraphrasing, not sure is that quote. So what's your reaction to Wheeler saying that? And, I'm guessing he's not the only player who's going to be in a situation or something similar. And how difficult would it be to actually quarantine players for 4 or 5 or 6 months, whatever it may be?
Yeah, to ask players, I think sometimes as fans we look at these guys and say, like, they make all of this money and they're playing a game, and of course they need to do whatever is necessary to just make it happen. But there are so many different human considerations that you have to kind of look at. And I mean, I don't blame Zach Wheeler, first of all, and I'm sure that he's not alone. I think that to ask a guy to step away from his family with or without the birth of his first child is a huge ask, and an unreasonable one at that. So I think Zach Wheeler is kind of a representation of a greater concern here. What happens, if in a normal situation, a guy, his wife will give, or his girlfriend or whoever will give birth, and then you come back 2, 3, 4 days later. In this situation, then what happens? You're gone for a few days, and then do you have to self-quarantine for another 14 by yourself away from your family before you can even rejoin your team? So is that player in limbo? I think that there's going to be enough pushback by the players union. And again, if you're a 22, 23-year-old single guy, you say, like, hey, let's go. Like, I want to get on the map, and I'll play anywhere at any time, anyhow. But so many of these guys do have families that I think that may be the biggest obstacle in figuring this out.
Bob Wankel from Crossing Broad joining us here on Bracy Sports Media. Bob, let's talk about some Phillies issues. And I think one of the biggest and most interesting issue that's kind of caught up in this is JT Realmuto. And they were negotiating possible extension with him. I guess those talks kind of stopped as spring training came around. And now we're in limbo. We don't know if we'll even have a season, at which case JT will become a free agent. What is your gut feeling as to how this situation affects JT and whether he will play with the Phillies again?
Well, obviously, this whole situation is so unique that I guess you should start by saying that anything is possible here. When you look at it logically, though, you hear, and this is real, that John Middleton loves JT Realmuto. You've heard about the wrestling connection and all of that, and Bryce Harper loves JT Realmuto. And the thing that I keep coming back to, not only did the Phillies give up a pretty hefty price to acquire him, and you'd say, like, after 1 year of baseball, this guy would possibly be gone. They can't let that happen. I do think that's true, but at some point, I'm curious to see what Bryce Harper's influence is in all of this. You bring him there, you obviously give him some assurances that we're going to do everything in our power to win. Bryce Harper loves the guy. They weren't as aggressive as I think some people expected them to be this winter. So, and Harper, for his part, seemed to understand that, at least publicly. But I wonder if behind closed doors he says, you've got to get this done at all costs. And again, it does come down to what Realmuto wants to do. I don't think that there's been so much damage here that they're not going to be able to get on the same page. But I think the Phillies are going to have to pay, and I don't think it's going to come at a discount. But if you ask me, do I think he'll be back after this season? I do. But I do think we might have some tense moments ahead as this thing gets figured out.
One of the things that I'm interested in seeing is how this affects contracts. I mean, with the way the economy is right now, I'm wondering if we're going to see, at least for the next 5 or so years, the big money contracts like Bryce Harper got. And I'm wondering if JT might be kicking himself like, man, I wish I would have taken the Phillies offer, even though maybe it wasn't an offer that was the best offer or what he wanted at the time. But I'm guessing that he's probably not going to get anywhere close to what was on the table. And I'm wondering what your opinion is.
Yeah, and a guy like Mookie Betts is in the same spot. He was a guy that was supposed to cash in on the next mega deal, and that's kind of up in the air right now. I don't know, and I think a lot of what you're saying is definitely possible. It's really going to depend on, I think, what the immediate future of Major League Baseball looks like. Do they play an 80 to 100 game season in Arizona? They lose their gate revenue at that point, which is roughly like 25 to 30% of what the owners take in a given year. So the TV contracts would be huge, and something's better than nothing. But even if they do play in an Arizona or a split Florida-Arizona situation, it's going to have a significant financial impact on the owners. So if there's no baseball at all, I think that what you're talking about becomes even more likely. Not that all of a sudden, JT Realmuto is worth 4 years, $60 million, but is he going to get the 125, 130? Maybe not.
Bob Wankel from Crossing Broad joining us here on Bracy Sports Media. Bob, let's talk about some more on-field issues. Let's assume there is baseball this season. What was your impression of the limited time that we saw from Joe Girardi in spring training? Obviously a lot different than Gabe Kapler. The comments coming out of spring training seem to be positive. I'm just wondering what your feeling is on what you saw so far from Girardi and what impact you think he's going to have.
Yeah, I think it's hard not to like Joe Girardi and to, even if you liked Gabe Kapler, I think it's hard to say like this isn't an upgrade. I believe Joe Girardi is a significant upgrade, and you did hear players talk about, and a lot of players talk both on and off the record about, this is a different clubhouse. There's accountability. You know who's in charge now. And I think there's something to be said for that. And even as a player, a lot of times it's not necessarily about a tangible difference. It's what you believe. And if you believe that you're in a better position and you believe that you're receiving better coaching and you have that buy-in, then more often than not, that's going to lead to positive results. So regardless of whether or not Joe Girardi and the staff is better, which I believe the staff as a whole is significantly better, these players do have a buy-in, and I think there's something to be said for that. Conversely, the thing that I'm going to really miss out, and the thing that I was really interested to see about this team, was that the excuses are gone now. You have a handful of younger players like Zach Eflin and Nick Pivetta and Scott Kingery, who I'm up on, and I believe that he's going to be a really good player for this team for a number of years. But last year, it seemed like everything that went wrong with the Phillies kind of got laid at the feet of the manager, in my opinion. And I believe that a lot of players got off the hook for that. And this spring, you saw a lot of guys come in and say, like, well, now we're getting this, and last year I wasn't utilized properly, or I didn't believe in the message. Well, now all of those excuses are out the window. And it's kind of time for these guys that have been around now 3-4 years in some cases, that have kind of been inconsistent at best, to take that step. They don't have that security blanket of the coaching staff or the manager anymore. So I think that Joe Girardi is an upgrade. I think he's one reason to feel really optimistic about this team, in addition to the pitching coach, Brian Price, and then the hitting coach. I believe that is the thing to feel better about with this team. The roster, and I don't know if you want to get into this or not, the roster is a different story, though.
So, yeah, let's talk about one of the players you mentioned, and I think he was one of the players that had a problem with the way he was utilized, which is Nick Pivetta. He was a starter. He was moved to the bullpen, kind of shuffled in and out. Clearly that had an effect on him. And his performance didn't show. I mean, I think he's one of the players now where he needs to show himself. You mentioned Brian Price, the pitching coach, and the reports are that, he's having a good impact. Of course, spring training, everything is usually rosy, right? So, the results are to be determined. But what is your feeling on Nick Pivetta? If you look at the rotation, you have Nola, you have Wheeler, you have Arrieta, which is up in the air. You have Eflin, who did pretty well in the second half. And then you have Pivetta, Velasquez, I don't know. So what do you think about that fifth starter? What do you think about Pivetta? And can he be the pitcher that the Phillies really think he can be?
So, I'll start by saying that if Gabe Kapler was back in 2020, I don't think that Nick Pivetta would have been. I think that situation had kind of run its course. There's enough talent there that it's worth a look. I think that if it were me, and though I do understand the need to kind of get some balance into the rotation and try your hand at a lefty, I probably would have started the season with Nick Pivetta. I would have seen if Brian Price could have a tangible impact on his performance. I'm not expecting a lot. And, saying that I would go with Nick Pivetta as a fifth starter is more just a wild card. Like, let's just throw it against the wall and see if it finally sticks. Because Vince Velasquez, who I like, I don't believe he's it. I don't believe he's a major league starter on a team that is expected to win more than 80 games. I don't believe that. And I think that we've seen enough now. He's made nearly 100 starts in his major league career. And I think though some guys do turn it on and around 27, 28 years old, he hasn't given us anything to suggest that he's actually matured. And so I look at Nick Pivetta and I simply say, I just haven't seen enough or maybe I haven't seen as much as I have with Vince, and so I'd be inclined to maybe give him that first shot. But I tell you, it would be a pretty tight leash for me. It would be 5-6 times through the rotation, and if we're not seeing any progress, I would quickly go to another option.
Bob Wankel from Crossing Broad joining us here on Bracy Sports Media. Bob, let's take a look at the lineup. It doesn't seem to be there's much competition other than center field with Hazley and Quinn. And I'm just wondering, we kind of, in the offseason, kind of sounded like from the comments we were hearing from Matt Klentak that it was kind of Hazley's job. But as spring training was kind of progressing, it sounded more and more like it was a competition, and maybe Roman Quinn was more of a contender for the job. We know Roman Quinn has, showed well when he's been in there, but injuries have been a constant problem with him over his career. What do you think about that situation, and what did you see out of spring training that tells you one or the other could get that starting job?
You get a new staff in and you look at Roman Quinn, and I think it's hard not to be seduced by him. I mean, the talent is there, and you can't mention his name without saying injuries within 10 seconds.
Right.
But I don't blame the coaching staff for getting into this and evaluating it and saying, hey, Roman Quinn's the guy. If it were me and all things were equal, I would probably roll with Roman Quinn too. It's a unique skill set. It's something that they don't have. I really like the player. I think he's if he were able to hold up, he's probably the better long-term option than Adam Hazley, who I believe Adam Hazley has a place on a major league roster. But one of the reasons that I'm a bit skeptical about this team as constructed is if Hazley is your everyday guy or has 100 to 115 starts in center field, I just think that that's a very big question mark. And I just don't believe that there's a ton of upside with Adam Hazley. I think he's a solid player, right, a fourth outfielder type, but I'm not let me say this. I was not surprised as spring moved on that Roman Quinn was getting more looks and becoming a bigger part of the conversation.
And one of the other big points out of spring training was Rhys Hoskins. We heard that he's working on this new stance. The results were, I guess, it's hard to, there weren't enough body of work there. But his second half last year was concerning. And he has said that he's going to come out for the better, because he knows that he's gone through struggles and can get through struggles. Perhaps that's positive self-talk. Perhaps that's his true belief. But I think that is really one of the biggest concerns if the Phillies are to be successful this year, is if there is a year, is Hoskins' kind of reemergence into the Rhys Hoskins we saw prior to the second half last year. What's your feeling on Rhys, and do you think this stance is anything, and a new hitting coach, is it a mental thing? What do you think what do you think is going to happen with Rhys?
And one thing you could say with absolute certainty is that he had never gone through anything like he went through the second half of last season. And when you're a player that has had as much success as he's had, and probably in a linear fashion almost, just everything went well for him from the time that he was a kid all the way up to the time he reached the major leagues. I wonder what the mental component contributed to his struggles last year. And I think just even the hard reset of saying, okay, I'm stepping away from it now, I'm coming back in, I think is going to be big for him. I think the change in the hitting coach is going to be big for him. I think the Phillies' confidence in Rhys Hoskins speaks volumes. That was one player that at the end of last season, he still, I know that it would have been selling low if you were to have moved on from him, but the Phillies could have gone in a different direction and just said, this may not be the long-term fit that we had hoped it would be. So for him to be the guy that was at the Joe Girardi press conference, for him to be a big part of like their off-season showcase, I think that was a commitment to Rhys Hoskins. And to be honest with you, when you looked at the way he struggled and the mental toll it took on him last year, I was encouraged about that show of faith. And I think that would have been a positive for him coming in. When you talk about the hand placement and the new stance and things of that nature, I don't know. And every player is different, but I start to worry a little bit when you make such a drastic change and you deviate so much from what has made you successful up to a given point. Now, you have to tinker, you have to adjust. A lot of really good baseball players over the years have come in and they seem like they have different stances almost monthly or bi-monthly. So, I don't want to say like, oh, that's a real reason for concern, but I just don't. It does give me a little bit of pause personally, and I know a lot of people view this as a positive, but it gives me some pause when you see guys make such drastic changes. And the hand placement thing, I don't know. I really don't. And we didn't see it enough to get a true feel for whether or not it was going to work. I was a little bit concerned in a limited sample, though, over the course of March and late February about what we saw. I wasn't particularly impressed with the swing, and I still think that some of the concerns that existed last season carried in. So, that's a timing thing. It's a comfort thing. He needs more bats with that stance if that's how he's going to proceed. But it wasn't like, oh, wow, this is all fixed now. That's for sure.
Bob Wankel, Phillies writer for Crossing Broad, joining us here on Bracy Sports Media. Bob, a couple more things I wanted to talk to you about, Phillies related. I think there's a plus and possible negative of this too. Plus side of this is the Phillies are going to get some healthy players back, particularly Andrew McCutchen and possibly Tommy Hunter. I guess there's really no other way to look at that than a positive, right? And what impact do you think McCutchen will have? We kind of saw it at the beginning of the season, and then when he left, there was a big leadership component. Is his impact more felt on the field or off the field, do you think?
Oh, I think it's both, and I think strongly both. But I do think that the off-the-field impact was huge. You were in there as well. I mean, I don't know. My impression last year, and not that I'm a seasoned reporter that's done this for 15, 20 years, but you walk in that clubhouse a lot of times, and you're just like, where's the spark? Where's the personality? Like, where's the – you had guys that were accountable. Reese Hoskins stood up every night. Bryce Harper stood up every night. It wasn't that guys were ducking accountability or not willing to talk, but there was no
personality.
There was no personality. There was no pop in that locker room, and he was a big part of that. And I know he was there at times in the second half, but he wasn't on the field, so it kind of limits what you can do. So I think that his presence and his energy is going to be massive. I'm a huge believer all the way down through the high school level about energy, about tone, just that vibe that you get from a team and feeding off of one another. I think it's a huge component of sports at all levels. And so to get him back, I think is going to be a tremendous boost for this team. From a baseball standpoint, the thing that I loved about him, you talk about the ability to get on base, but really you saw this with the Yankees before he came to Philadelphia. The guy had just feasted on fastballs. And when you got into that Realmuto, Harper, middle of the order, you had to go hard at him because he has a great eye. He's going to get on base. You don't want him to reach base, so you have to challenge him more often than not. And when you challenge a guy, you're going to have to do it with fastballs. And so his ability to hit the fastball was just so big for this team. And, that was a huge hole. They spent the rest of the season trying to figure a way to patch it, and they just never could do it. And so the on-field presence, assuming that he is somewhat similar to what he was prior to getting hurt, which I think he will be, is going to be a tremendous boost for them as well. It's a massive upgrade, and it's a massive he's going to have a massive impact on this team if they do play.
The last question I want to have for you is, what is your gut feeling about whether we'll have baseball this year? And also, how do you think the Phillies will fare in a revamped, situation?
If it's like the Arizona, Florida situation and they go with expanded rosters, I also think that people talk about getting Spencer Howard and maybe out Bohm, and that's great, but Phillies aren't a particularly deep team. And I think that if they do expand rosters out, that other teams are going to benefit from that as well, more than the Phillies might. I'm not optimistic about the Phillies. Now, if they get into the right realignment and the season's condensed to a point where you limit the sample of games played, it creates the opportunity for more parity, I would say. But I just, in a regular situation, I don't love this team. I think that they would have been a third-place team, fringe wildcard contender. And to that end, I think they would have been a little bit disappointing. Do I think there's going to be baseball played? It just really depends by the day. If you would have asked me at the end of last week, I would have told you no. I know we're dealing with a lot right now. It doesn't look good when you turn on the news, but you look at some of the longer-term projections, and I want to tread lightly as I say this, but there are some glimmers of hope. Right. So maybe. I think that baseball is going to do everything that they can to get onto the field at some point. So I'll say if I had to guess, whereas last week I was saying no, I'll say that there may be a situation, but I don't think it's going to be before mid-July. I really don't.
Well, as a baseball fan, first and foremost, I certainly hope the game comes back. I really miss baseball and, miss going to games at Citzens Bank Park and miss the ice cream too. But
Miss the ice cream too. The
obviously there are bigger issues right now, but definitely hope baseball returns. Bob, thanks so much for joining us. You can read Bob's stuff on crossingbroad.com. Follow Bob on Twitter, Bob Wankel CB, and listen to him on his podcast, Crossed Up. Bob, thanks so much for joining us on Bracy Sports Media.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.